The bones of the men were left where they fell, their skulls fractured, their arms raised in a defensive position so consistent across different sites that analysts have given it a name. Their bodies, unburied, left in the open or thrown into pits without ceremony, without the grave goods that their culture reserved for the honored dead. They were not mourned, they were disposed of, but the women were not there. This is the detail that has unsettled archaeologists and geneticists working on prehistoric conflict for the past 3 decades. At massacre site after massacre site across Neolithic Europe, across the prehistoric Americas, across every continent where the evidence has been systematically examined, the pattern repeats: men killed, children killed, women absent. The explanation that took longest to confirm was the one that most clearly fit. The women were not killed, they were taken. And the consequences of that practice, carried out across thousands of years of human prehistory, are written permanently into our shared genetic inheritance in ways we are only now learning to read. What happened to the women of defeated groups is not a question that can be answered with a single event or a single culture. It is a structural feature of intergroup violence that runs across the full span of our prehistory, documented in bone, confirmed in DNA, and visible in patterns of demographic collapse and replacement that reshaped entire populations. To understand it, we have to begin not with the raids themselves, but with what the Earth gave back when we finally learned how to ask. In 2015, a team of geneticists published the results of an ancient DNA analysis that should have been front-page news in every publication on Earth. Working from skeletal samples taken across Europe and Central Asia, they traced the genetic history of the continent's population across a span of roughly 10,000 years. What they found was not gradual change, it was replacement. Between approximately 4,000 and 3,000 BCE, the genetic signature of the men who had been living in Central and Western Europe, the Neolithic farmers who had built the megalithic monuments, who had cleared the forests and planted the first fields, effectively disappeared. The steppe-derived paternal lineages associated with the Yamnaya culture and their descendants came to dominate the male genetic record across an enormous geographic area within what amounts, in evolutionary terms, to a geological instant. The replacement was not symmetric. This is the critical detail. The mitochondrial DNA, the genetic material passed exclusively through the maternal line, showed a far more mixed picture. The women of the older European populations did not disappear from the gene pool with the same completeness as the men. Their lineages persisted, diluted but present, woven into the genetic fabric of populations that now carried almost entirely new paternal lines. The men changed, the women were incorporated. A 2019 study analyzing ancient DNA from the Iberian Peninsula found that between 4,500 and 4,000 years ago, the Y chromosome of the resident male population was replaced with near totality. Estimates range above 90%, while female genetic continuity remains substantially higher. The researchers described the pattern as consistent with male-biased migration. The language was careful, the implication was not. What the genetics describe in the aggregate across multiple populations and multiple millennia is the systematic elimination of competing males and the absorption of their female kin, repeated at sufficient scale and frequency to rewrite the paternal genetic history of an entire continent. The genetic signal required violence at scale to produce. The massacre sites provided the mechanism. The Talheim death pit in Baden-Württemberg, Germany, dates to approximately 5,000 BCE. It contains the remains of 34 individuals, men, women, and children, killed with blows to the skull and thrown into a mass grave. The weapon trauma is consistent with axes and adzes. Are the tools of their own culture turned against them? The arrangement of the bodies suggests they were thrown in without ceremony after death elsewhere, then covered. But the demographics of the dead are abnormal. When researchers analyzed the skeletal remains against the expected population composition of a Neolithic village, they found a significant underrepresentation of young women of reproductive age. The dead did not represent a complete community. Some people were missing. At Aspern-Schletz in Lower Austria, also dating to the 5th millennium BCE, the pattern sharpens. More than 200 individuals were found in and around the settlement's defensive ditch, a number consistent with the entire population of the site. Nearly all showed perimortem trauma, blows to the head, in most cases from behind. But again, all the young women were absent from the count. The site represents what appears to be the total annihilation of one community by another, with the conspicuous exception of the demographic group most valuable to an attacking force seeking to expand its own reproductive capacity. The Crow Creek site in South Dakota, dating to approximately 1325 CE, is later by millennia, but belongs to the same behavioral pattern. Nearly 500 individuals were recovered from a mass grave, a number representing the likely total population of the village. The majority showed evidence of perimortem trauma, scalping, decapitation, and the removal of hands and feet, interpreted as trophy taking. The skeletal demographics showed a consistent absence of young adult females. Yet the researchers who analyzed the site estimated that between 60 and 75 women of reproductive age were unaccounted for relative to the expected population. They were not in the grave. They were somewhere else. These sites are not outliers. They are the sites we have found. The sites we have found represent a fraction of the violence that occurred. What they establish across independent geographic regions and independent time periods is a consistent behavioral template. Attack, kill the males and non-reproductive individuals, take the reproductive females. This was not aberration. It was strategy. To understand why this pattern was so consistent, we have to understand the reproductive mathematics of small prehistoric groups. A band of 20 to 50 individuals occupying a territory could only sustain itself through a birth rate sufficient to offset the mortality it faced, from disease, from accident, from starvation, from the violence of other groups. The limiting factor on reproductive output in such a group was not the number of males. A single male could, in biological terms, father many children. The limiting factor was the number of females of reproductive age. More women meant more births, meant more group members, meant better survival odds in every category of threat the Paleolithic could produce. The capture of women from defeated groups was not a cultural phenomenon layered on top of violence. It was one of the primary objectives of violence. This logic is not unique to humans. No, it appears across social species that form competitive coalitions. The behavioral pattern is old enough to predate our genus. But in humans, it took on a consistency and a geographic scale that no other species has matched, because humans plan, coordinate, and remember. Raids were not spontaneous. They required intelligence about the target group's location and strength. They required coordination among attackers, and they required a shared understanding of the objective, which the genetic and archaeological record suggests was, with remarkable consistency, the same objective across thousands of years and thousands of kilometers. The competitive pressure between groups did not operate in isolation, and it was amplified by resource scarcity. The same droughts and climate fluctuations that drove the agricultural transitions of the Neolithic also compressed territory, pushed groups into contact with populations they would otherwise have had space to avoid, and raised the stakes of each confrontation. A group that failed to expand its reproductive base during a period of population's pressure did not simply remain smaller than its competitors. It was eventually absorbed or eliminated by them. The groups that survived were, disproportionately, the groups that raided effectively. This is a brutal form of selection pressure, but it is selection pressure that the genetic record confirms was real and consequential, and that shaped the behavioral repertoire of the species that produced it. Pre-dawn attacks meant exploiting darkness and sleep as force multipliers, targeted killing of adult males first, the greatest threat and the population most expendable to the attacker's reproductive interests. Swift movement to prevent a defensive response from neighboring groups or returning hunters. The violence was not prolonged. It was concentrated and purposeful. The sites where resistance had occurred showed defensive wounds on male skeletons, forearm fractures from blows blocked too late, cranial trauma from multiple directions suggesting men who turned to fight. Most of the women's skeletons recovered from massacre sites show no such defensive injuries. The evidence suggests they were not given the opportunity to resist. Weapons recovered from massacre-associated contexts tell their own story about the degree of organization involved. The Neolithic raids documented at Central European sites were not conducted with improvised tools. Stone axes of standardized design, the same implement types found in dedicated caches far from any settlement, suggesting deliberate pre-raid equipment preparation, appear as the primary wound-producing instruments at multiple massacre sites across France, Germany, and Austria. The standardization implies coordination, multiple attackers using the same weapon type, moving in the same direction, producing the same wound patterns on the same skeletal locations, are not individuals acting independently in the heat of a confrontation. They are a unit. They practiced. They came with a plan. The children present a demographic complexity that the simplest version of the story cannot absorb. At several massacre sites, children were killed. Infants and very young children appear in the victim counts at Talheim and at the Witten site in Germany, but older children, particularly girls, show the same underrepresentation as young adult women. The threshold appears to have been roughly reproductive potential. Those who could contribute to the group's future births were taken. Those too young to be immediately useful and too burdensome to transport were not. This is not inference softened by distance. It is the demographic implication of the bones that were and were not left behind. What happened to the women who were taken is a question the bones answer partially, and the genetics answer more completely. A skeletal trauma analysis of female remains in populations adjacent to documented raid cultures. Women who appear in the archaeological record of communities other than those they were born into, identified through isotopic analysis of their teeth, which records the geology of where a person spent their childhood, shows patterns of injury consistent with coercive integration, healed fractures on the radius and ulna, the bones most commonly broken in a defensive posture, compression fractures of the vertebrae, dental evidence of prolonged nutritional stress in early adulthood, followed by relative improvement, the biological signature of a person who suffered significantly and then survived into a different nutritional environment. The isotopic studies of burial populations from Neolithic and Bronze Age Europe have identified a consistent phenomenon. Women buried at settlements show more dietary and geographic diversity than the men buried alongside them. In a landmark analysis of the corded ware culture, one of the steppe-derived cultures that contributed to the mass male replacement identified in genetic studies, researchers found that a significant proportion of the women buried in high-status graves had spent their childhoods in geologically distinct regions. They had been born elsewhere. They had arrived in these communities as adults. How they arrived is not recorded in the isotopes, but the context, the concurrent elimination of the male populations of exactly those distant regions, is preserved in the genetic and archaeological record around them. A 2017 study focusing on a Bronze Age community in Bavaria found that of the women buried in the settlement cemetery, nearly half showed strontium isotope ratios in their tooth enamel inconsistent with local geology. They were outsiders, integrated into the community as adults, buried with the grave goods of full community members, suggesting that whatever the conditions of their arrival, their social absorption over time was complete. The researchers noted the pattern appeared too consistent and too sex-biased to be explained by ordinary trade or alliance-based marriage exchange between neighboring groups. The movement was directional and it was large. What the evidence does not record, and what we should not pretend it does, is the interior experience of these women. The isotopes tell us where they were born and where they died. They do not tell us what happened in the years between. The skeletal trauma evidence provides some indication. But trauma heals, and healed injury is not suffering quantified. It is survival documented. The women who appear in these burial populations were the ones who lived. The record is biased, structurally, toward the women who endured long enough to die in a community that buried its members. What became of the others, those who did not survive the transition, those who died in the months of violence and forced movement before any absorption was possible, is not in the data. It is in the absence of data. The women who were incorporated into new groups did not simply disappear into those groups as anonymous demographic units. They carried their cultures with them, their ceramic styles, their plant knowledge, their languages, their technologies. Archaeologists have long observed the persistence of material culture traditions through periods of violent population replacement that should, by the logic of conquest, have erased them. The explanation is the women. A conquered people's pottery style survived for generations, not because the conquering group adopted it through admiration, but because the women who made it were still alive and still making it. The genetic and cultural record of prehistoric Europe is, in significant part, the record of what women carried with them when they had no choice about where they were going. The demographic consequences of this practice, accumulated across centuries, were not small. Ancient DNA studies from populations in prehistoric Europe, the Americas, Central Asia, and the Pacific consistently show the same signature when violent replacement events occurred: a sharp contraction of male genetic diversity, followed by a gradual recovery built on a new paternal foundation, and a comparatively broader female genetic base, incorporating both the incoming lineages and the surviving traces of what came before. The Y chromosome bottlenecks identified in multiple world regions, periods in which the paternal genetic diversity of entire continental populations collapsed to a fraction of its previous breadth, align with the archaeological periods of intensified intergroup conflict. They are not coincidences. They are the genetic record of mass killing of males and absorption of females, all repeated at sufficient frequency to leave a mark that persists in every man alive today who carries the descendant lineages of those replacement events. In one analysis published in 2018, researchers modeling the genetic dynamics of Bronze Age Europe estimated that the effective male population of Central European lineages passed through a bottleneck so severe that, at its nadir, as few as one man for every 17 women was contributing paternal lineages to subsequent generations. The arithmetic of that ratio is not subtle. It does not describe a world where men were dying faster of disease or famine. It describes a world where the killing of men in raided communities and the capture of their women was occurring at a population scale sufficient to restructure the genetic history of an entire continent. We should be careful about what this history means and what it does not mean. The behavioral pattern described here, raiding, male killing, female capture, was not universal or continuous across all of human prehistory. Periods and regions of relative stability existed. Archaeological evidence of long-term peaceful coexistence between neighboring groups exists alongside the massacre sites, and the simplification of all prehistoric intergroup relations to a single violent template distorts as much as it reveals. The same cultures that left massacre pits also left evidence of trade networks spanning hundreds of kilometers, of gift exchange between distant groups, of deliberate marriage alliances that moved women voluntarily between communities as diplomatic acts. Violence and exchange operated in parallel, and the line between them, in conditions of acute resource pressure, was often determined by circumstances rather than character. But the pattern was real, it was widespread, and it was consequential at a scale that has permanently shaped who we are. Every person alive today is the genetic descendant of women who survived, through whatever combination of circumstance, utility, and endurance, events that killed the men around them. That survival was often not chosen. It was the outcome of a logic that treated women's bodies as reproductive resources to be transferred rather than persons to be killed. A logic that was, from the cold arithmetic of group competition, devastatingly effective. The groups that raided, that took, that incorporated, those are the groups whose descendants populated the next 10,000 years. The cultural consequences were as permanent as the genetic ones. The languages spoken in Europe today are almost entirely descended from the Indo-European language family introduced with the steppe migrations. The same migrations that produced the male Y chromosome replacement events documented in the ancient DNA studies. But the substrate languages of pre-migration Europe, spoken by the populations that were demographically replaced, did not entirely vanish. Traces persist in place names, in loanwords, in the grammatical structures of languages that absorbed them. The women who were taken carried their first languages with them into new communities. Their children grew up bilingual, or learned the dominant language first and the mother tongue second. Over generations, the substrate eroded, but it did not disappear completely. The linguistic ghost of the defeated populations survived as their genetic ghosts survived in the maternal line, transmitted quietly, generation after generation, by women who had no other way to transmit it. This is not a story about barbarism that we have since transcended. It is a story about the conditions under which human behavior operates when the constraints that currently contain it are absent. The constraints are real. They are legal, social, institutional, and moral. They were built, slowly, over millennia, against a background of exactly the behavior they were designed to prevent. The distance between the Aspern-Schletz ditch and the present is not the distance of human nature changing. It is the distance of human institutions accumulating.